the things that we do today, the American people are still incredibly generous in international aid. There are two pieces in the United States. It's a little bit different sometimes in other countries, but there are two pieces in the United States. There's the amount of money Americans give with their tax dollars. Last year, about $50 billion, 5-0. And then there's the amount of money Americans contribute privately, maybe through NGOs or through organizations or through charities. And that's last year was about $70 billion. So that public-private partnership, if you will, really begins with this mission we're talking about right here, the Jamestown and America's first humanitarian mission.
Thank you for joining us here. A bit about Stephen's background. Stephen Puleo is an author, historian, teacher, and a sought-after public speaker. He's published 7 narrative history books, many award-winning and best-loved histories of Boston, including Dark Tide, the Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, The Boston Italians, and A City So Grand, the Rise of an American Metropolis, Boston 1850 to 1900. His books on American history have been equally popular, particularly American Treasures, The Secret Efforts to Save the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Gettysburg Address, and The Caning, the assault that drove America to civil war. Many of his works have been woven into the curricula of high schools and colleges, and 25 communities have selected his books as community reads. Most recently, the town of Milton, which is going to be reading the book in 2020. Steve is a former award-winning newspaper reporter and a contributor of articles and book reviews to such publications as American History Magazine, Politico, and Boston Globe. He's taught history at Suffolk University in Boston, and he currently teaches at UMass Boston. It is an honor to have Steve with us, well, virtually with us tonight, but there's even more in store. I want to hand this over to Kristen Motti, my colleague at the Boston Public Library. Kristen.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm Kristen Motti, as Margaret said. I am a programs librarian at the Boston Public Library, and we are so thrilled to be here again tonight in partnership with American Ancestors and WGBH Forum Network in celebration of Stephen Puleo's new book. I'm so happy to be here together in this virtual space. Thank you all for coming. We do have a special guest with us. Jean Maguire is the library director at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. Her areas of research interest include digital library and archives collections, Italian genealogy, and Irish genealogy. She has presented on all of these topics and has helped to lead participants on American Ancestors and NEHGS research tours of both Dublin, Ireland, and Belfast, Northern Ireland. Please join me in welcoming Jean. Jean, thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you for those nice introductory remarks, Kristen and Margaret. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this gathering of book and history enthusiasts. We're so glad you could join us. Nearly 700 of you signed up for this event, which is tremendous, and we thank you for supporting authors at this time and for supporting organizations like ours who work with authors and readers. Before Stephen Puleo and I begin our conversation, I'm going to share some brief historical background to Voyage of Mercy and the events it covers. Remember, as has been said before, that you can indicate if you would like to ask Steve a question later during our Q&A. Steve has generously offered to take a wide range of questions, whether they're about various topics covered in Voyage of Mercy, or they're about his other books, or they're about the writing process in general. And Steve and I both have Italian ancestry too, and he's written a book about Italian Bostonians, so I'm sure we'd be very open to questions on that as well. So it seems to me that Voyage of Mercy unintentionally comes out at a time when it can be especially meaningful, during this time of global coronavirus crisis, and it could be instructive to us now, and perhaps even inspirational. So let's start with some historical background. I think Many people are familiar with the fact that there was this event, this Irish Famine, or Great Hunger, as it is often called, especially people in places like Massachusetts, which such sizable Irish American populations. However, many people may not know all the reasons why the famine came about and why it went on as long as it did and caused such extraordinary suffering. And there are many books you can read on that subject. In Stephen's book, you can learn something about that background and evolution of the famine, and you can also learn this specific story about the USS Jamestown, a major part of the aid provided by the United States, and how its mission was the beginning of the United States' role in providing large-scale relief to other nations. You have Irish people in the countryside this time, about a third of the Irish population, who grow the potato as both a sale crop and a food crop, which the people live on. The focus on growing potatoes is largely due to the fact that it was the most productive crop to grow on the very often small lots that the Irish were restricted to, thanks to oppressive British laws. The potato was also simple to grow, simple to cook, and it happens that it was highly nutritious. There had been a partial potato blight the year before the Great Famine in 1845, as well as in many previous years. But now this major blight occurs beginning virtually overnight in the middle of the summer of 1846 and wipes out all the potatoes. You have British landlords whom the Irish work for, who demand that all other crops continue to be exported from Ireland throughout the famine instead of being used to feed the people who grow them. You have a British government which has no empathy for the Irish and doesn't want to upset the economy and the export markets, doesn't want to impose price controls on the food so the Irish can afford to buy it to feed themselves. And there was also the excruciating slow turning of British bureaucratic wheels. The narrative in Voyage of Mercy shifts back and forth between Ireland and the United States and uses many Irish, British, and American voices, but keeps returning to the stories of three historical figures: Robert Bennett Forbes, Father Tybalt Matthew, and Sir Charles Trevelyan. The suffering and needs of the Irish people are being communicated to the British government by many sources, including British officials, and including an Irish Catholic priest in County Cork, Father Tybalt Matthew. Father Matthew works tirelessly to help the suffering people of Ireland, those right around him in Cork, whom he's helping by using his own hands, his own money, and those elsewhere in Ireland, helping them with the accounts and the appeals he's sending out to the world. He writes to people everywhere trying to get help. He writes highly compelling and fact-filled letters repeatedly to Sir Charles Trevelyan, who is the British government official responsible for famine relief. Trevelyan is an abysmal failure in this role, not just lacking all empathy, but actually having contempt for the Irish. He does very little in the way of helpful action, and he's not encouraged by his boss, Prime Minister Lord John Russell, to take action to help the Irish. In fact, Russell charges Trevelyan with shutting down the Relief Commission in Ireland in the summer of 1846, right before the Blight, and replacing it with a works program, because he and others believed you should let the Irish fend for themselves, or otherwise they'll get used to being dependent on the government. In other words, it should be tough love. It's really not until January of 1847 that the true depth of the misery in Ireland, the starvation, the disease, the evictions, is communicated to a large number of Americans by ships that arrive from Ireland and England bringing the news. Many well-known and well-respected Americans quickly take up the cause, spread the word, and petition the US government to take action. The US at this point is a nation at war in the highly controversial war with Mexico, and is experiencing deep divisions, especially with the issue of slavery, the war, and with geographic expansion in general. But appeals are successfully made for unity in America's response to helping the Irish. Committees are formed all around the country, in cities and in small towns. Local organizations get involved, as well as individuals, college student groups, and on and on. People are contributing both money and food. And you can read more about all of these things in Steve's book. Of particular importance on the part of the Boston and New England response to the crisis is Robert Bennett Forbes. Forbes is a person with so much accomplishment, adventure, and drama in his life that this book could have been just about him. And I suspect Steve would have had no problem filling the pages. I'm going to let Steve address the topic of Forbes in more detail. And I'll just say that Forbes was a Bostonian. He was an experienced ship captain, and he was an international merchant. He was 42 at the time of the Jamestown's mission. He had begun working on ships as a boy, had many adventures and tragedies and near tragedies, had a family, and he had lived through for what most people would be the equivalent of multiple lives by the point of what occurs in the book with the Jamestown mission. He is remarkably well equipped to take on this Voyage of Mercy. The US Congress authorizes that 2 naval ships be used for the mission and be captained and manned by private individuals. The USS Jamestown is prepared very quickly and sets sail on March 28, 1847, destined for Cork, Ireland, with 8,000 barrels of food. And at that tantalizing point in the story, I will stop and I will begin our conversation with Steve. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Jean. How are you? Thank you so much for the introduction.
You're very welcome. Great to see you. Great to have you here. I'm glad that our listeners can hear from you directly. I wondered if you might like to start this by, I was just talking about Forbes, and I wonder if you would like to share maybe some of the essential facts and characteristics of Forbes that, in your view, made him the person for this job.
Sure. First of all, I mean, you got it right, I think, Jean, when you said that Forbes could have a book all to himself. No question about that. He is a doer. He is a swashbuckler. He is an adventurer. He is a ship captain that had his first voyage across the Atlantic when he was 6 years old, when his mother took him to chase their ne'er-do-well father. He was a cabin boy on a ship to China when he was 13. He commanded a ship when he was 20. He was a millionaire by the time he was 30, lost his money in the late 30s and recovered it all by the time he was 40. So he was one of these people who loved the sea. Between the ages of 17 and 27, he said he was on land for maybe 6 months during that 10-year period. When he finally gets back from a long voyage to China in 1840, he does stay home for several years. He and his wife, who had some tragedy earlier in their lives, have several children, and he becomes a shipbuilder, a ship owner, and he remains close to home until this tremendous voyage of the Jamestown in 1847. So he's one of these characters that I think is larger than life in Boston and everywhere. And from my standpoint, one of the great things about him is he also wrote prolifically. He wrote diaries, he wrote logbooks, he wrote letters, and saved them all, and all of those are preserved. And you know, we're a big source in this book. So a tremendous lead character overall.
Yeah. Yes, you're fortunate in many respects. Not only a great character, but a great record keeper, documenting everything, giving you a lot of source material to work with. Maybe you can talk about, you know, why this is chosen as a major part of relief. You know, why was sending direct aid in the form of food better than sending money, for example?
Sure. For one thing, it was quicker. It would be much faster to get food into the hands of the Irish people. For the other reason, prices were higher in Ireland. So food, I mean money, even though a lot of people did send money, money didn't go as far as it would here. So those are the two big reasons that the Irish people preferred direct aid. Father Matthew, who you talked about, writes to the United States and says it would be much better to have direct aid for our people because we can get it to them more quickly and, of course, more cheaply.
Right. Now, America does act quickly. There's definitely a lot of sympathy in America for this cause, and a lot of notable people, as I mentioned, who rally around and many who support Forbes. There's a lot of talk right away as soon as they get the news from overseas of what's going on. But now they've got to try to take big action. They need Congress to take action. And maybe you can talk a little bit about, what goes into that. There's a question of constitutionality on the part of many of those in Congress, with this, a mission like this not being prohibited in the Constitution, but not being explicitly allowed for either, that power not being given. So what's some of the debate and the actors involved in this?
Sure. As Congress begins debate on this in February of 1847, they start very quickly after they get the news. There's a real concerted move in Congress to appropriate $500,000 towards Irish relief. President Polk at the time signals in advance that he's going to veto that because he believes it's unconstitutional for the United States taxpayers for money from the United States taxpayers to be used for overseas relief. So Congress shifts very quickly, and they do want to make this bounty national, as they say. Senator Crittenden from Kentucky uses that phrase. And so very quickly they decide, well, how about if we take the two warships that you mentioned in the introduction, the Jamestown and the Macedonian, and we turn them over to civilian captains to provide relief. We strip them of their deck guns, we convert them to ships of mercy, if you will, and the Jamestown is the first ship of mercy. So that's Congress's main role. There are also senators and the president himself who form a committee in Washington, D.C. that's an advisory committee to the different states and to different communities around the country. Their job is to encourage states and towns and cities to set up Irish relief committees, which they indeed do. So that is the real government contribution to this effort. Most of the food, as you mentioned, is donated by private individuals across the country. So
the Congress goes ahead, does this, takes a big step, they feel, in turning over a public ship to private citizens and entrusting this costly vessel and the mission to these folks. Can you talk about the officers and the crew that Forbes puts together? It's quite an assortment of people. Who were they and what were their roles?
Sure. So Robert Grant Forbes, of course, an experienced captain, hires 3 other experienced captains to serve as his officers on the Jamestown. But most experienced sailors, military sailors and otherwise, are involved in the Mexican War on ships about to take part in the Battle of Veracruz in Mexico. So Forbes has to hire a ragtag bunch of very inexperienced people. They volunteer, they really want to do it, they're enthusiastic about doing it, but they're cooks, they're accountants, they're clerks. He gets letters from them, some who say, I've never been at sea before, which is stunning, and they're going to go on this trip to Ireland. And so he really whips them into shape. And for the first 10 days of the voyage or so, weather is terrible: ice, sleet, snow, wind, freezing conditions. They don't know how to climb riggings. They have to get their grips on riggings and on ropes and everything like that. So it's a really, really difficult operation for Forbes to kind of pull together. But he has great leadership ability and he's able to do so.
Yes, they do make it there, right? There are challenges with the weather, a little bit of challenge with the ship, perhaps even, and this crew who's maybe not always up to dealing with all those challenges, but has the able captain.
Right. So the ship, the Jamestown itself, has, as you pointed out, 10,000 tons of food on board. It's laden pretty low in the water. It leaks from very early in the voyage, so there's a lot of bailing going on. So there is the possibility that this voyage is going to be a disaster from the outset, and Forbes is able to corral the ship. Weather breaks, as they get a little bit closer towards Ireland, and it turns out to be a success. They make it across in very rapid fashion into County Cork Harbor.
Yes, I enjoyed reading about how he felt a little bit competitive with another vessel. I believe maybe it was coming from Philadelphia, and had, I think, left sooner, but Forbes was making better time, and that was a source of great satisfaction to him.
He's a very competitive guy, and you're right. The ship literally pulls alongside Forbes. They chat, and Forbes does get to Cork first. He was very excited about that.
Probably that kind of competitiveness and determination is what helped him take on what was a pretty, an unprecedented mission and a huge one. And just preparing the vessel ahead of time, what he had to do to get all that in order, get it provisioned, communicate with people in Ireland and England. Maybe you can talk about that a little too. That's an interesting part. He needs to kind of lay the groundwork for some things for when the ship might arrive.
So Forbes writes dozens of letters to British officials, Irish officials in advance to let them know what he's going to need. He's going to need all this to be duty-free. He's going to need help unloading the ship when he gets there. He really paves the ground for this effort. He wants everything to be ready when he gets there. His goal, as he points out, is to get home as fast as possible. He wants to get back to his family as quickly as possible. So he does a lot of advance work to make this mission a success. Many letters to the Treasury Department in England for that whole thing about making sure these are duty-free. He doesn't want to violate any British laws, but he wants the laws essentially suspended so that this food can be dropped off, since it's a charitable donation. And he's largely successful in that effort.
As we mentioned, there was another mission, that of the ship Macedonian, authorized by Congress at the same time as the Jamestown mission. Now, there are some good reasons why you did not write a book primarily about the Macedonian. Can you share some of that with the audience?
Sure, because they were the second ship and not the first, Gene. So the Macedonian runs into lots of bureaucratic trouble in New York. Some political turf battles, some battles with a New York relief committee that's trying to donate food to Ireland. And so the Macedonian doesn't get the number of supplies that it needs. And the captain, George Takei, who's been selected, a very experienced captain, former captain in the Argentine military, is despondent over this. He ends up spending about $30,000 of his own money to try to get this mission off the ground. And so the Macedonian doesn't sail until June of 1847, 3 months after the Jamestown. And again, the Irish are very happy about this. They give them the same kind of welcome that the Jamestown, got. But the Jamestown is the first ship to head in that direction, and it starts off this massive American relief effort.
And so the U.S. sees that it can do this successfully. It has basically carried out this whole thing successfully and more, as you've alluded to. I mean, that this is just one part. It's a big start for it, but there's so much more relief that comes from America. So the U.S. people see that they can do this. And so how did these efforts for Ireland continue after the voyages of the Jamestown and the Macedonian? I mean, the famine goes on. So how does that relief continue?
Yeah, so the Jamestown is the first of 150 ships that would sail from Ireland, from the United States of America, over a 16-month period. For all of 1847 and right into June of 1848, this is really an astounding effort. It is an epic relief effort. I say that this story is really a story of hope and generosity and goodwill against this unfathomable despair. And it's two epic events. It's the famine is the epic on one side of the ocean, but on the United States side of the ocean, the relief effort is really epic. So you had Americans from all geographic locations, all religions, all races, all occupations, farmers, shopkeepers, saloon keepers, blacksmiths, contributing food, direct aid food to Ireland. And in the case of most of these folks, it's food they grew for themselves. They planted it. they cultivated it, they harvested it for their families, or to take to market to buy something, for their families. And instead, they put this food on kegs, and they put it in burlap sacks, and they put them on, small boats that went down the Ohio and small boats that went down the Erie Canal to large ports in New York and Philadelphia and Boston for shipment to Ireland. It really is an astounding kind of an effort by the people of the United States. And I should say, it was big cities that participated. It was small towns. It was frontier outposts, in the West, which at the time was Michigan and Wisconsin. So almost every small town in the United States had an Irish Relief Committee, which is pretty remarkable.
It is. Yeah, and do you think a message of that Jamestown mission, as well as this larger U.S. effort today, versus there's some isolationism today. We have a lot of crises that go on. Do you see some message for us today from the past?
So I'd rather say that the Jamestown really starts the legacy of American humanitarian aid around the world. So the things that we do today, the American people are still incredibly generous in international aid. There are two pieces in the United States. It's a little bit different sometimes in other countries, but there are two pieces in the United States. There's the amount of money Americans give with their tax dollars. Last year, about $50 billion, 50. And then there's the amount of money Americans contribute privately, maybe through NGOs or through organizations or through charities. And that's last year was about $70 billion. So that public-private partnership, if you will, really begins with this mission we're talking about right here, the Jamestown and America's first humanitarian mission, and it continues to this day. So I kind of look at the Jamestown and that effort in 1847, 1848 as the foundation for the way America still contributes today.
Yeah. And so now the relief has happened during the famine, but in spite of that relief, emigration from Ireland escalates over the course of 1847. There's a huge amount of chain migration, with Irish emigrating to America and quickly sending money back to relatives in Ireland so they in turn can pay for passage to America too. And this saves countless lives. Would you perhaps like to share a little more about the emigration during this period, during this time of 1847 and beyond?
Sure. There, as you say, massive immigration from Ireland. 5,000 ships leave Ireland during the Great Famine, and that's approximately 1847 to 1851. Those are the famine years that we're talking about for this great migration. But an example for Boston alone, in 1847, Boston was a city of about 115,000 people, and 37,000 immigrants come to Boston in 1847. Maybe 30,000 of those are from Ireland. So they completely changed the face of Boston as one city. They become very quickly, they become important in Boston. They become politically active and powerful in Boston. So if you look at the way the Irish migration changed the city, it goes from a very, I would say, closed Brahmin kind of city in the late 1840s till right after the Civil War, 1870, let's say, becomes much, much more of an Irish city. And by the 1880s, almost all the political power in Boston is held by the Irish. So it's amazing. And so the Irish left Ireland. Some went to Canada, most went to the United States, some went other places. But there was this real feeling on the part of the Irish people that they didn't want to go to Canada. It was a British possession. They wanted to get away from the crown, right? That was a big part of this migratory effort, although it was cheaper to go to Canada. So many people, many Irish immigrants first sailed to Canada and then sailed to the United States. They were called two-boaters. And so many people in the Boston area, in the New York area, are descendants of those two-boaters who went first to Canada and then came to the United States.
Indeed, great point. Great point. See, our time is flying by here, so I want to turn it over to you to perhaps give us your view of this story after having spent all this time researching it, and just a reminder again to folks that they can raise their hand if they have questions for later in the Q&A. Turn it over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Jean. And I first just want to say, I want to thank everybody here. So this effort behind the scenes has been fabulous. NEHGS and BPL really made this happen. They adapted this original live event to this Zoom format, which was fabulous, and I really appreciate that. WGBH Zoom team that's working this behind the scenes. This is a technical extravaganza, I can tell you that. They're doing a fabulous job. Porter Square Books is responsible for the book part of this, and they're one of the great independent bookstores anywhere, so I wanted to thank them. Most of all, I really want to thank the attendees. Many of them are my readers. Many of them I don't know, but many of them I think I do know. And I miss you guys. I miss you guys. This is my 591st appearance as an author. I've made a couple of those as Zoom appearances, but I love live appearances. I love meeting readers, love talking to them about these kinds of stories, these kind of historical stories. And I so appreciate their loyalty, and it means such a great deal to me that they turned out tonight. So I want to thank you for that. So this story, we've talked a lot about it. There's a few things that I wanted to touch on that we haven't, and then I want to get to questions quickly, because most of this can unfold during questions, and the interactive part of this is my favorite part of this. I often get the question, why did the United States do this? This is the first humanitarian mission, not just from the United States, but really the world's first humanitarian mission. Think about this. Before this mission, countries went to war with each other. They pillaged each other's cities, they burned each other's crops. Occasionally, they traded with each other from an economic standpoint, when the economy required that. But the notion of one country helping another country for purely altruistic reasons just didn't happen until this effort, until this 1847 effort by the United States. And I think the reason for that, people say, why? Why then? What was the reason for it? And I think lots of things come together, as so often happens in history. And as I've talked to many of my history followers and readers about this, a lot of things come together, some related, some not related, to make this happen. Number one, Jean mentioned this a little bit. There is some real angst, particularly among the Northeast, I'd say, intellectuals, about the Mexican War. Real guilt. Why are we at war? Can't we do something else? Can't we do something good for people? There's some issues about that, number one. Number two, we're right in the midst of the reform era here in Massachusetts and across the country. Prison reform, education reform, mental health reform, the women's suffrage movement is underway. And of course, the abolitionist movement. So we're still about 5 years or so before the real militant abolitionist movement begins, but it's very, very active. So that's underway. We're in the midst of the Second Great Awakening, right? The religious awakening. I mean, think about this. Roman Catholics, you might expect, would contribute to Ireland, but every religion does it here. Jews, Quakers, Methodists, Presbyterians, all the Protestant sects, Unitarians, they all pitch in, and that kind of religious awakening piece, I think, comes to bear during this mission. And then I think the other big one is this manifest destiny issue in the United States at this time. So 1846, the first time the phrase manifest destiny is used. What does that mean? It means that the United States is expanding. People are going west. This is a few years before the gold rush, but people begin to pull up stakes in 1846 and go west. And there's a real feeling among Americans as part of that. Sometimes manifest destiny gets a bad name, but there's a real good piece of that. And the piece is this. America is a land of abundance, most people felt. We have navigable rivers. We have lots of arable land. And because we have such abundance, we should share with others. And so I think that comes to bear as part of this mission too. So when people say, why did it happen and then, why did it happen then? I think all those reasons come to bear. And then think about this. It doesn't happen really after 1850 for another 30 years. The United States turns inward, right? We have the whole slavery debate during the 1850s. We have the Civil War. We have the assassination of a president. We have a Reconstruction, tough Reconstruction period. And it's not till the second Irish famine, the second big Irish famine in 1880, when the United States does it again, contributes these same kinds of things, makes a warship, the USS Constellation, available for civilian reasons and a mission of mercy. And from then on, I think, as I said, the legacy of this mission carries on. So think about what the United States does, right? They help Cuba shortly after the Spanish-American War. They send money to Messina, Sicily after the earthquake there in 1908. They help after the Halifax explosion, which people in Boston know really well because we sent food and medical supplies to Halifax. Herbert Hoover helps feed 10 million Belgians at the beginning of the First World War, whose food supplies are confiscated by Germans. And so he helps them before the US gets into the war. The Berlin airlift in 1948, massive effort where United States pilots and British pilots and Australian pilots, deliver billions of tons of food to the people of Berlin who are encircled by Soviet troops, and on and on and on, all the way up to the present day. So I think we have that little break during that 30-year period between 1850 and 1880. And then since then, the generosity of the American people comes through again and again and again. And it's done in this kind of public-private partnership that I think is so important. The other thing I just wanted to touch on quickly, and then it would be great to get to questions, I think. People ask about this famine in Ireland, and Jean touched on most of the issues at the time. But people ask me about it, there's this really bad blood, bitterness, rancor between the British and the Irish for 150 years after this famine, right up until the turn of this century, the 21st century, and even into this century. How do you view the famine in terms of Britain's response? And there are some Irish historians who view it as a genocide. I do not. I do think that the British handled this in a way that was incompetent, indifferent, inept, with anti-Catholicism. It was a catastrophic handling of this famine by the time they eventually tried to get food to Ireland. It's way too late. They do put about 3 million people on soup kitchens, but it's not until very summer of 1847, just too late. It's remarkable that the British did feed that many people in a country with very few interior roads, but they spend a lot of time on the bureaucratic part of organizing relief, making sure the paperwork is correct for relief, and not serving a single bowl of soup for a very, very long time. So that's my take on the way the British handled it. They do have this disdain for Ireland, this contempt for Ireland. They view it as a backward country. Sir Charles Trevelyan says, "What hope is there for a nation which lives on potatoes?" So I think all of that goes into play in the British response. And I think one of the most searing, bitter scenes and images that the Irish people have, and Jean alluded to this in her intro, is Irish people starving, freezing, wandering the countryside of Ireland while carts filled with food, escorted by British troops, were being delivered to ports. And so I think that is the reason in 1999, as late as 1999, that an Irish historian says, the Great Famine has been the unseen guest at every Irish dinner table for the last century and a half.
I wonder if you and your family have done any genealogical research into your wife's Irish ancestry, because you mentioned it a bit at the beginning and end of your book and sort of preface and acknowledgements. And just wonder if you've done research into your family.
Yeah, you're right. I married into a very large Irish family. My wife is one of 13. So I have a great, wonderful Irish family. I did do some genealogical research on my father-in-law's side of the family, was able to trace it back to the first immigrant here in the United States, to one of two people who came right before the Civil War, so in the wake of this famine, I would say. And I have an educated guess as to who the right person was, but never could really document it at that time. But I was able to get their descendants all the way down to my father-in-law. So I would call it an effort of about 95% by me on that genealogical history.
Hey, well done. Glad that you've been able to do that. And our gallery's up, so I'm going to start calling on folks here in the order that I see them. I see John Baxter. Can you share with us your question for Steve?
Hi, Jean. Yes, thank you. As Jean mentioned, we can't even believe the amount of research that goes into putting your book together like this. And I was just wondering, my Irish ancestors were working as stevedores along the docks of Boston. And I know that when the Jamestown was loaded on St. Patrick's Day, I think it was March 17th through the 27th, with 800 tons of supplies. I'm just wondering if in your research, you came across a list of all the people that helped. Being ex-Navy, I know how much it takes to load a ship.
John, thank you for your service, and also thanks for your really kind comments about the research. So you're absolutely right. These stevedores, and many of them were of Irish heritage, right, volunteer their time to load the Jamestown, which is really extraordinary. Some of the loading is taking place right on St. Patrick's Day, which was, really poetic in a sense. Forbes even comments on that. But no, there is no list of the folks that helped in that sense. There is a list of crew members. There is one Irish crew member whose last name is Hughes. And sadly enough, and much to the chagrin of Robert Bennett Forbes, on the return voyage, he gets washed overboard basically and dies. And it was one of the lasting disappointments for Forbes, because Hughes was one of his few seasoned seamen and one of the seamen of Irish heritage. So it really broke Forbes's heart. But the list of the stevedores and the folks that loaded at the docks at the Charlestown Navy Yard, no list that I know of exists. But thank you much for the question.
Yes, very interesting question. Maybe that's a genealogist there looking for lists of people. We're always trying to place them in a particular place at a particular time, looking for those lists. Let's move to Peggy. Peggy, what's your question?
Hi, I would like to ask Stephen, how can you explain the discrepancy between the great generosity of American citizens at this point and then the later antagonism, really, once the Irish immigrated to the United States? What changed?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And I don't think so much changed, right? It just is a little different when it comes closer to your shores, which of course is not an excuse for it, but just the way it is. So I mentioned earlier that about 30,000 Irish arrive in this small geographic footprint city of Boston that has a population of about 115,000 people. Most of the Irish that arrive are very, very poor. Many of them are sick. They have no way to support themselves. And so it really is a little too much for the city of Boston to absorb. There's that piece of it. Number two, there is strong anti-Catholic feelings in Ireland. I mean, I done a lot of study of the Italian immigration movement, which has similar issues. But one issue that I think the Irish clear the way for us, for the Italians on, is this anti-Catholic issue. There's real concerns about popery, right? And control by the Vatican. And so that's a huge part of this largely Brahmin city that is run by a very small group here of Protestant elites. There's no other way to say it in Boston. It's a tiny city at the time with with that kind of power, it concentrated, and it's a small geographic city. at the time. This is prior to the filling in of the Back Bay, which really expands the city. So the Irish basically inundate the north end of Boston, fill the tenements of the north end. And so I think all those tensions go into it. There's this anti-Catholicism, there's, this just general antithesis towards immigrants, but the size of the immigration, the size of the migration, the city can't handle it at the outset. I think all those factors go into it, Peggy. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks a lot. Great
Good.
answer.
Okay, great.
Yes, and in fact, I think you mention in the book, Steve, that when Forbes and the ship arrive, and there are all these speeches, and there's talk about, oh, great, from the Irish about, well, this must be the way that the Irish are received in America as well. That this beneficence and this warm feeling toward the Irish, and yet,
Right.
not entirely so, unfortunately. All right, let's move on to Bridget. Bridget, do you have a question for Steve?
Yes, I do. I would like to know if there were any ramifications politically from the British government to the Americans because of aid given to the Irish. We were not probably the British's favorite country anyway, since it had been less than 100 years since we were independent. But I wondered if there was any political ramifications that were noteworthy.
Yeah, great question, Bridget. There were. So there was some great concern by members of Congress as to how this would affect U.S.-British relations if we were to contribute. So part of the debate in Congress concerns exactly that. And we were also at the time in negotiations with the British for Oregon Territory. This was a big negotiating point that was happening at the time. And so would that be part of this effort? How would the British feel about us stepping in this area? And then there was, of course, the opposite side, where a lot of lawmakers said, why are we helping Ireland when Britain is not? So there was that part of the debate too. So yes, the geopolitical situation between the United States and England is definitely a part of this discussion. Great question, Bridget.
Yes. On to Peter. Peter, do you have a question for Steve?
I did, until Bridget started talking.
It got taken from you?
It got taken to. Hi, Stephen. I loved your book, The Boston Italians. I'm an Italian genealogist with.
Thank you, Peter.
And my question has been answered, so move on to the next.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter. How about John? John Streff?
Thanks, Peter.
Hey, Steve, I enjoyed your talk and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I just had a question about your writing and research process, or research and writing process. I know you're an educator and a prolific writer. I teach high school in Medford, and I'm hoping to start a book project pretty soon. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of take us through the process that you engage in. Thank you.
Sure, John. And I worked in Medford for many years, so I know the city well. So great city. Hope everything's going well for you guys. Well, sure. I mean, I like to, when people ask me this question, and I get this question a lot, and I think you'd get this question from editors and agents as well, is, do you have a topic that, number one, is interesting and compelling as a story, right? There's a real important piece of this, which is a story, a narrative, something that drives it forward. Do you have something has great characters, real life characters? I mean, in this book, you have Forbes and you have Father Matthew and you have Trevelyan, who are really terrific characters, right? So that's an important piece. And, people think characters are just for fiction, but no, nonfiction has characters too. And three, for me, is there a big picture? Is there a big message you're trying to get across? What is the big surrounding history that's part of this? And so what I do is I try to build these stories from the characters out. If that makes any sense to you, you get your characters, you make sure they're strong characters, and you then build your story out. And then you let the story piece of this, the narrative piece of this, pull the big history along. I've had many people come to me and say to me, the history goes down easy in your books. And I take that as a great compliment because I think what they're saying is that the narrative story pulls that big history along. And I say to readers, I want you to learn the big history in spite of yourself, because there's sometimes this great fear among readers like, oh, isn't history supposed to be dull and boring and dry? And of course, it's the exact opposite. So one way to get that across is, how does your story get told? How does your story run? And then I'd say the last piece for me, you have to make sure you have sources. So unlike a fiction writer who creates his characters or her characters, you know, I have to make sure I do this within the bounds of great research and truth and all of that. So if I have characters that leave a tremendous amount of writing, like Robert Bennett Forbes leaves, or if there's great government records, like the British government records by both Parliament and the Crown on the famine, boy, you know, I'm in luck, you know. So I try to put all of that together when I come up with a story idea or a book idea. Does that answer your question, John, or did you have anything more specific? Good.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Good luck with that book project, John.
Yes.
On to Kathleen Carter. There you are.
Hi there. It's a pleasure to be here and listen to Steve today. I just wanted to say I'm really looking forward to reading this because of my Irish heritage. And my husband is also 100% from Shaka. His heritage is from Shaka, Sicily, just like yours, Steve. And we really enjoyed reading this book right here. It really helped us because I also am into genealogy. And we actually made a visit to Shaka to do additional research and obtain some documents. And I'm wondering if you had a chance to visit Shaka, Sicily yourself.
Well, first of all, Kathleen, I guessed you were Irish by your first name, which is also my wife's first name. Great Irish name, Kathleen. Second of all, thanks for the really nice compliment, and thanks for reading the Boston Italians. I appreciate that. No, I've never been to Shaka, so I feel like I have to get there. When my grandparents emigrated from Shaka, it was a small town, a small fishing village. I understand it's significantly larger now, but no, that's on my list to do. So is it worth, I should go there, huh?
Yes, definitely. The central part of the town is absolutely stunning, completely walkable. I highly recommend you attend it during, if you can, when they're having one of the festivals, the Italian festivals. And it was a once in a lifetime experience. We loved it. We can't wait to go back. And my husband, like you, I think you're both eligible to become Italian citizens by blood. So is that something you're thinking of doing as well, a dual citizenship?
So first of all, Kathleen, yes, I'm dying to go there. I'm ready to bust out anyway. Like I'll take dinner in the North End right now to just start. But yes, ready to bust out. Yes, I am eligible for Italian citizenship. I haven't really considered it, and I don't know if I will. You know, I'm very, very proud of my heritage, but I consider myself an Italian American, which I think is great. So for this, at this time, it's not high on my list, this dual citizenship, but it is high on my list to get to Shaka, I think, yes.
It's stunning and beautiful. You'll love it. So, and thank you so much for all of this. And we really enjoy it.
Thank you, Kathleen. I second the endorsement of Sicily,
Thanks,
although
Kathleen.
I haven't been to Shaka in particular. It sounds great. Catherine Devine.
Yes, actually, Kevin, my wife and I are both on here, so
Okay.
it's listing is.
Oh, okay.
Just so everybody's not confused. Thank you, first of all, Stephen and Jean and WGBH. This has been fantastic, and I hope there's more of these to come. My father is 100% Irish, so I've inherited this hatred about the famine. So to hear this positive spin on it has been both enlightening and fascinating, and thank you for that. Our question is, were any of the ships able to bring immigrants back to the United States with them?
Yeah, great question from the Divines. I appreciate that. So one of the things Forbes makes very clear when he goes over is that he will not be taking any immigrants back. There is he knows that there's this desire by the Irish to get out of Ireland. And so, no, most of these relief ships do not. There are some stowaways on these relief ships when they come back, none on the Jamestown. He does offer Father Matthew a trip back to the United States, which kind of breaks his own rule, right? Matthew declines at that point, just says he doesn't feel like he could leave Ireland during this dire time. And Matthew comes to the United States in 1849, for a huge tour of the United States, which I do write about in the book. But no, there's no big, large number of immigrants that come back on the relief ships from America. They're pretty strict about that they want that control. Excellent question.
All right, I think we have time for one more participant's question. I want to squeeze in a quick one here, Steve, because there was someone who very much wanted to join and was having some technical trouble with her mic. I had a very interesting question, which was just curious about what was the food that was put onto the ship and brought to Ireland? What in particular were those food items?
Yeah. Well, yeah, so you name it, corn, peas, grain, venison, pork, beef, rye, any kind of grain that you could imagine, bacon, dried peaches and other kinds of fruits. And also bags upon bags of clothing the Jamestown carried over there. So anything you could can, anything you could cure, anything you could salt, and safely get across, that's what the Jamestown carried.
Okay, let's take one more. Robin McCarthy, question.
Hi, just a couple, one's real quick. With WGBH being involved, I'm wondering if there's any possibility they might make your book into a series on PBS, because I know they're very involved with that. But my real question is about.
I certainly hope so, Robin. I certainly hope so. Go ahead.
Me too. So the other thing is about why was Boston such the favorite location? I mean, I know there's a large Irish population in New York as well, but why was Boston hit so heavily with the incoming immigrants over other ports?
Yeah. So. Yeah, let me be clear. So Boston is a big port, New York is a big port, Philadelphia is a big port. So all of those are big Irish ports. New York, numerically far larger than Boston, as you might expect. But they're easy to get to, right? They're on the East Coast. They're cheaper to get to. There are Irish that eventually go south. There are Irish, like Italians, that eventually go to New Orleans, for example, and other places. But they are cheaper to get to. It's an easier sail. And, those are your three big port cities. And so that's why. And for coming from Canada, some of those two boaters that I talked about, Boston is kind of a natural big city to go from Nova Scotia, let's say, and swing back down. So very practical reasons, the immigrants who came, not unlike most immigrants, are poor. They've scraped together their savings to take this, sail across the Atlantic. And so the cheaper it can be, the most economical it can be for them, that's what they want to do. So that's the reason.
Well, I guess it just sounded like Boston received the largest influx of immigrants over the other ports is really what I was asking.
Yeah, no, they did not. In terms of numbers, New York is far larger in almost every immigrant group, right? But I use Boston because of the percentage of Irish that come compared with the population of the city at the time. There's no question that the influx of Irish to Boston as a percentage basis is really the highest of any city, mainly because Boston is so small during this time.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, we really had some great questions. What a terrific variety. I'd like to keep going. Everyone's coming up with such interesting things.
Excellent.
I'm going to try to just sort of tie things up here at this point with one final question for you, Steve. You've perhaps heard the news of the significant recent donations from Ireland to the Navajo Nation and Hopi Reservation, inspired by the giving of money to Ireland by the Choctaw Nation in 1847. Have you reflected on that in light of your book? Does it make you think of other examples inspired by Irish famine relief?
I have reflected on that. In fact, when the story broke in the New York Times, I think it was just, I think it might have just been earlier this week or last week. I was just shocked that it came, in the midst of the discussion of this book. So you're absolutely right. The Choctaw, which was the tribe that was part of the Trail of Tears several years before the famine, contribute $175 in Oklahoma to the Irish famine. And it sets up this long-standing relationship between the Irish and Native Americans, the Choctaws specifically. The president of Ireland in 1995, Mary Robinson, visits with Choctaw Nation, becomes selected as the only woman who was an elder of Choctaw Nation at that time. And so the United States and Ireland have a very strong relationship in general because of the US help during the famine. But this relationship with the Native American population and the Irish is really, I think, unique in terms of this international scope of it. But I think the Native Americans, the Choctaw at the time, realized what they had been through on their Trail of Tears, felt that they had an obligation to help the Irish, and that bond has continued, right up till this day.
It's beautiful, and it really, like you say, what a coincidence that this happens at the time of your book. I was really struck by that. Well, I hope many people will read this book. It's absorbing, and read it especially for how the story maybe can be a guide to us today when it comes to international relations and global crises. Buy a copy for others that you know. And I thank you, Steve. I thank our excellent participants with their questions.
And I would also like to echo that. I want to thank everybody for being on this call. Thanks for your great questions. I really enjoyed it very much. Keep reading, keep being in touch with me, and I hope to see you all soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. On behalf of the Boston Public Library, I would like to thank all of you for coming tonight. I would like to thank Steve and Jean. What a wonderful conversation we've had. I'd also like to thank American Ancestors, our partner in this collaboration, as well as WGBH Forum Network. And Margaret, it's been a pleasure again, and I look forward to working with you again next week.
It's been a real pleasure being on screen with you and being with you, Steve, and also with you, Jean. And I thank all of you for joining us. What a great time having a book that it's about hope and generosity and benevolence. And it's taking us to places that we can't go right now. And I agree with you about the North End, Steve. I would love to go out to dinner in the North End. So Jean and I work at the oldest genealogical organization in the country. And it's really a thrill helping people with their family research. We love stories, we love history, we love all sorts of backgrounds. And we hope that Kristen and I hope that you'll join us back here online again for more authors, but we also hope that you'll join us where we are physically usually. My organization, AmericanAncestors.org, is very much up and running. Our genealogists, our librarians, all of our databases, we're all at a full clip helping people do research on their families during this at-home time. So come back and see us there. And of course, if we were together in person, we would be asking you to consider purchasing a book. So I would like to do that virtually. Please, won't you consider supporting this author and the series by buying your copy of Voyage of Mercy through our partners at Porter Square Books. They will ship it to you free if you mention the code AMINSP, as like an American Inspiration 20, and you'll see the information on your screen. They're at portersquare.com. Long live independent bookstores. With the Boston Public Library, we'll be doing more of these author events for your enjoyment, for ours, and for the sake of keeping arts and culture live in this challenging time, very much alive. On May 20, we'll take an in-depth look at DNA testing and the impact that it's having on American families. Journalist Libby Copeland will join us with her investigative work, The Lost Family, She'll be in conversation with Amy Doxer Marcus, the Wall Street Journal's Pulitzer Prize-winning health and science reporter who's written extensively on the topic. And on May 20, award-winning author Honor Moore will join us with her biography memoir, Our Revolution, A Mother and Daughter at Mid-Century. The State Library of Massachusetts is joining us as a presenter, along with the Boston Public Library. Kristen and I are delighted to welcome them to that one event. And our guest moderator will be the novelist Claire Massoud. So for now, we wish all of you, though, a wonderful and inspirational evening. Thank you to everyone, and have a very good, safe night.